Walking Dead: A New Frontier is the third game in Telltale Games' acclaimed series based on Robert Kirkman's comics. Released initially in December of 2016, it had a 5-part episodic run into mid-2017. Timeline-wise, it picks up after the events of The Walking Dead Season 2, but shifts focus to an entirely new group of characters, relegating previous flagship character Clementine to a supporting role. Influenced by lead writer Adam Eskenazi Douglas's own Cuban-American heritage, the game focuses on the Garcias, a Cuban-American family living in the Richmond, Virginia area when the zombie apocalypse starts. The player takes on the role of Javier Garcia, the former Major League Baseball player kicked out of the league after engaging in illegal betting. When the apocalypse starts during a visit home for his father's death, Javier finds himself thrust into the role of caring for his older brother David's wife and kids, in a world that no longer makes sense. More than just your typical zombie apocalypse story, A New Frontier uses its backdrop to tell a unique story about family, loyalty, and betrayal, and the line between chaos and order. It is also, almost universally, the most hated game in the series. Why is this? Why does a game that landed so hard emotionally with me fail in the eyes of dedicated Walking Dead fans? The answer to both bad and good lies within the game's mechanics. How does the limitations of the branching narrative genre make it difficult to successfully create a cohesive multi-part saga? Is an author wanting to tell their own story necessarily a betrayal of series fans? And can a choice matter, even if the outcome is always the same? What is it that keeps me coming back to this game, despite all its flaws? A New Frontier follows Telltale Games' signature choose-your-own-adventure episodic style of game design, a formula that much resembles the story machine method discussed in Jesse Schell's The Art of Game Design, A Book of Lenses. For most of its runtime, the game presents to the player what is essentially a never-ending cutscene, with frequent pauses in the dialogue to provide the player with dialogue options, typically 3 different line choices, and Telltale's classic, silence, always a valid option.
These kinds of missions don't usually go so well, but you found every single one of your people. And you found them alive, healthy, reasonably cheerful. It's a hell of a thing. Well, some things are worth saying woo-hoo about, that's all.
Larger, more consequential choices in the game are usually presented in either-or 2-option format. This subverts the traditionally passive narrative format of a cutscene as described by Sebastian Domsch, melding interactivity and necessary for the story passivity together almost seamlessly. Together, these choices make up the story's path, which can be mapped quite similarly to the combinatorial problem that Schell illustrates in his book, that there are different paths you can take to get there, all of them eventually lead to a cohesion point in the story so that every player can keep playing the same game. The story is split into 5 episodes averaging between an hour and 30 minutes to 2 hours each. Apart from the choice elements, the game also incorporates small exploration and action sections. Exploration takes the form of a simple point-and-click in which the player can walk around an environment, talk to characters optionally, and receive extra flavor dialogue on certain things.
Okay, now I'm sorry I did that.
Action, on the other hand, takes the form of QuickTime events in which the player must perform certain combinations of buttons in order to complete an action, whether it's bashing the zombie's head in or jumping across rooftops. As Telltale designs its games primarily around choice, perhaps the best lens to look at A&F's interactivity is through the Anatomy of Choice outline defined by Katie Salen and Eric Zimmerman in Rules of Play. Before the player is given a choice, the game provides context, typically in the form of conversation. The player is expected to listen to the other characters and take in their current argument or situation.
Well, is he one of them?
Hey, man, what do you mean by them? Who's them?
You know what I'm talking about. The New Frontier.
What? No, I'm not with those guys. You got this backwards.
Javi, this guy's full of donkey shit.
Do you want to let me talk?
What's the point? How can we trust anything you say?
The possibility of choice is then conveyed via 4 dialogue options, or in the case of larger decisions, 2 opposing consequential choices. The possibility and motivation to make a choice is also made challenging by the addition of a timer. The player only has a certain amount of time to respond to each dialogue prompt. Failure to respond in time will result in defaulted silence. Larger choices in the game vary between timed and non-timed depending on the situation in the story, though of course, pausing the game to have a 5-minute debate about what to do with your sibling is always a valid option. One of the interesting things about the way that dialogue choices are conveyed in the game is that, before the player makes them, they are given in short summaries. The options presented are not exactly what Javier will say each time. This can lead to a couple different scenarios. Often, the extra dialogue that comes from choosing to say something that on the surface seems simpler will deepen the conversation emotionally, or at times add a humorous element.
You're a real charmer. You know that? Through and through.
Oh, you know what they say. Takes one to know one. Now, what can I say? I fucking love pudding.
On the contrary, those vaguer summaries of choices can lead a player to say something that they didn't really mean to say, which, even if the dialogue is not consequential, can break a player's immersion. At its worst, when it comes to vague wording and important choices, you can look at the Conrad choice, a situation in which you have to choose whether to break up a tense conflict by either agreeing to a man's demands or choosing to shoot Conrad. Because the choice was not directly worded kill, a majority of players might have chosen to do so, simply to disarm him. The actual result, however, is a dead shot to the head, killing Conrad forever. Consequently, the statistics for this choice are disproportionately one-sided, but more on this later. Ultimately, the player makes a choice simply with the press of a button, resulting in the next line of dialogue or the next consequential action to be taken. Telltale makes use of a notification system to inform the player when a dialogue choice is important in some way. After selecting an option, a reminder will pop up in the corner of the screen telling the player something along the lines of X character will remember that. While said remembering doesn't always feel like it comes into play in practice, the indicators nevertheless create a sense of weight to even your small decisions, and have the ability to get the player thinking about what they're doing, even to the point of second-guessing themselves. The result of a choice in A and F is not always immediately clear. Some things are an immediate choice, as described by Avanavnarian, like choosing to kill someone and immediately seeing their death. But other events, like choosing to start a relationship with your brother's wife, are long-term choices that have consequences playing out across episodes. Telltale is also unique in that finishing an episode gives you access to a summary of your important choices in the form of statistics. You can see your personal choices compared to the rest of the game's players in real time, leading to discussion, incentive to go back for alternate choices, and the continuation of the Big G, the game continuing to exist outside of its individual episodes, as Ralph Koster emphasizes in A Theory of Fun. A New Frontier stands out against the Telltale formula in the multiple instances that it lies to the player about its interactivity in a sense, to varying degrees of consequence. In this game, failure to successfully perform a QuickTime event typically does not have consequences other than some pretty hilarious game over sequences.
Come on. Let's jump.
In exactly one instance, though, a character will jump in to save Javier if the player fails, resulting in his permanent death. That instance is simultaneously unique and troubling in its uniqueness. While a new type of consequence is refreshing to see in a more formulaic game, a player could easily feel betrayed or confused by missing something the game hadn't led them to believe was important. Probably the most infamous example of this interactive lying comes into play late in the game, when Javier goes up against Joan, the corrupt leader of the Richmond community. In order to punish Javi and his family for all that they've done to disrupt her community, she brings out two of his group's members and forces a choice upon him, the choice of which one should live. The choice is presented simply, the same as any other important choice in the story. Save Ava, or save Tripp. When the player comes to a decision and selects it, Joan will kill the opposite of the person that the player selected, in order to, as she says, teach Javier a lesson about betrayal. Many players despise that choice, finding it to be a cheap way of producing shock in the player, but I actually think it's pretty clever. Yes, it will make you mad, and it's supposed to. It's insulting not only on a narrative level if you cared about the character you were saving, but also on a higher plane of the relationship between the player and the game, particularly in the roles that the player has been taught, the fundamentals of what always happens in a Telltale game. The rules are important. They tell the player what is possible and inform their decisions and enjoyment of the game, as Domst outlines. But why should a villain play fair? Using the mechanics against the player in order to advance the narrative and drive home a theme of the game, betrayal, is admittedly a huge risk, but one that remains sharper in my mind than many other black and white choices in this game genre. Despite being a Walking Dead branded game, I would argue that A New Frontier has very little to do with zombies. It is a story about redemption, reconnection, and severing of ties with family, what it means to love someone who will always be imperfect. Well, that's what Javier's story is about anyways. Because of being a Walking Dead branded game, the story also suffers from the burden of having to continue the story of a previous fan-favorite character, Clementine, a burden that often creates dissonance in the narrative, weakens some central parts of the main story, and even alters players' perceptions of Javier as a character. In Javier's narrative, the game makes wonderful use of backstory in the form of flashbacks. Each episode begins with a small section showing a portion of Javi's life before the apocalypse, from the moment it started, to deciding to leave the family home, to earlier interactions with David, Kate, and the kids, to promising his dying father that he will take care of his brother. These sections have some of the best writing and acting in the game, and they accomplish the job of bringing us closer to Javier and his family, while foreshadowing and enhancing the events of the episode to come. Conversely, Clementine's flashbacks in the game severely hurt the game's narrative. The writers were left with the difficult, if not impossible, task of cohesively carrying her ongoing story over from Season 2's highly divisive 5 possible outcome ending. In order to fit her into the story here, the game reads a player's Season 2 save if available, which results in an unceremonious wrap-up of the player's ending decision in order to get all Clementines on the same page for the 3rd season.
Crap!
I got it. Turn the wheel.
Don't!
players were rightfully upset about this. Season 2 was no picnic, and depending on your choices, to have a fan-favorite character from both Season 1 and 2 killed off in a random car crash isn't ideal. This situation perfectly illustrates Shell's combinatorial problem from earlier, and the inevitability of players' disappointment in multiple ending-style games. They are quite literally almost impossible to follow up satisfyingly. After the results of Season 2 are displayed, Clementine's story follows her care and subsequent loss of AJ, the baby she salvaged out of the wreckage of Season 2's cast. Once per episode, Clementine will disrupt the game's current story and whatever Javier is doing to give us another disjointed piece of her past. These sections are weakly written, often confusing, and directly undermine the themes going on in Javi's story. Where Javier's interactions with his family, both past and present, aim to tell a tale of enduring love and forgiveness when necessary, Clementine's short story ultimately comes to the conclusion that everyone is abandoned eventually. Even worse, her seemingly unimportant or vague choices in these tiny flashback sections actually influences the ending and possible deaths of Javier's family during the final end sequence. These consequences are completely unclear while playing the game, require quite a bit of research to piece it together as the Steam guide shows, and are honestly just unfair. While the variety of endings is refreshing, each one is worth its weight and adds value to Javier's story, it doesn't make sense that a random 13-year-old that he met literally a few days ago can determine the fate of his family that he's known for his entire life. This speaks to a larger issue of Javier's story being part of a greater franchise. As lead writer Adam Eskenazi Douglas speaks to in his director's commentary for the game, the team was under a lot of pressure to deliver on Clementine's story after the success of the previous games. At the same time, there was a desire to do something new, something different, to tell a story they hadn't told before, as any author would want to do. The general audience of the game, though, wasn't overly willing to drop everything and invest themselves in an established family of people that they didn't know. Clementine becoming involved with Javier, then, only creates more dissonance in the game's narrative design. The writers feel an obligation to include Clementine, and an option to always side with Clementine, even in places where it doesn't really make sense for Javi as a character. This doesn't mean that he's a bad character at all. In reality, he has a very established point of view, complex relationships and motivations, all of the formula for an engaging protagonist as described by Carolyn Handler Miller. But when Clementine is on screen, it feels like she's trying to appeal more directly to the player than Javier. She expects him to cover for her after she accidentally murders someone about 30 minutes after you meet, and guilts the player if you, maybe logically, decide not to do so. She tries to convince Javier that his own brother that he's known for all of his life is, in her words, a fucking baby killer, despite him being a mostly successful father of two. There's even a choice where Clementine expects Javier and the player to help her assist the suicide of a man not in his right mind in order for a slim chance at learning the location of baby AJ. In any other game, these choices would be divisive, even ridiculous. Telltale always aims to make its important choices a 50-50 split. But when a choice between killing a new character and doing what Clementine wants you to do has a 90 to 10% split, there's something strange going on. It's the fact that a lot of people, due to prior narrative expectations in the presence of an established character, actually choose to play this way, as themselves lovers of Clementine, rather than playing the role of Javier and allowing themselves to be immersed in his life. Why I honestly think that the game comes off as disappointing to many people is the fact that they aren't really allowing the game to tell the story that it is, and instead expect it to be something that it's just not. And that's not the writer's fault in my mind. It's trapped between a rock and a hard place, trying to tell a story so desperately unique in the shadow of a franchise so much bigger than itself. The writers have spoken to the game getting cut short due to negative player feedback, to fighting against management to be allowed to put the emotional rooftop conversation between Javier and David, one of the best scenes of the game, in at all, over a push for more action, more zombie-related deaths. There was never going to be an easy way to tell a story so personal, so individual, and maybe not relatable to everyone, but that doesn't mean that it never should have been told, and that it never should have been told here. But despite all the flaws, all the dissonances and unfair expectations, stories cut short, there's still something here that pulls on my heart like no other Walking Dead game has. What stands out to me is the complexity and realness of every member of Javier's family, and the ways in which the game actually uses the limitations of its format in order to further the narrative of each character. The common complaint about all Telltale games, this one included, is that your choices don't actually matter, that everything leads to the same outcome, it's just smoke and mirrors. One of the penultimate moments of the game is Episode 5's fight between Javier and David. This conflict is a classic example of that complaint. Whether or not the player initiated a relationship between Javi and David's wife, Kate, he will believe that you did, and try to kill you for breaking up his family, for taking his role, for always being better than him, for so many inadequacies and conflicts unsaid. The scene starts like any other action sequence in the game. You get geared up for some quick-time events, and then the game presents you with a choice. To fight back, or to say, as your own brother knocks you to the ground, David, I love you.
Stop it!
This was a moment that shook me to the core, sprung tears into my eyes. It doesn't really matter what you choose. David will continue fighting you almost to the death, whether you fight back or not. But but it's the incredible tearful acting from Jeff Shine, Javi's actor. It's the shocked look on David's face as he denies the love that he can clearly hear Javier screaming at.
How fucking dare you!
That's enough! Stop it! David, stop!
Oh my god! I love you! No! Stop saying that! Dad, no!
Gabe! Oh my god!
You're not taking my family from me!
David, no!
I'm gonna fucking kill you!
Fucking stop! Jordan, stop!
I love you, brother. No!
What gets me, time and time, about this game is the importance of being able to talk to someone who isn't listening to you. Anyone who's ever had any kind of conflict with a family member knows that there is hardly ever a truly satisfying resolution. There is no perfect family that exists, so in a game about a deeply flawed and traumatized one, why should your own choices be able to change the course of a man who doesn't believe that he can change? So often in reality, there are things that you can't fix about a person, no matter how much you want to, how much you care, how much you try. And this is what makes the Garcia family so real to me. The fact that Javier is no hero, no savior. He can't give Gabe, a boy who had to grow up in the apocalypse, who watched his baby sister die in front of him, who idolized his lost father, a childhood. He can't fix Kate, a desperate woman's failing marriage, or save her from her own selfishness, even if he loves her. He cannot bring his own brother home again, because that home doesn't exist anymore. He can empathize, he can understand, he can condemn. But he can never save David. And that's not bad game design or lack of choice consequence, it's fantastic character writing. I can immerse myself so much in the role of playing Javier because I see some of my own father in David, because I see myself and my little brother within Javi and Gabe's dual parent, older brother relationship. Inevitability is the game's driving force. This is a family that was destined to fall apart. There is no happy ending for them. If anything, the zombie apocalypse probably kept them together longer than continuing to live a normal life would have. Instead of the typical trope of the zombie apocalypse bringing out the worst in people, A New Frontier asks, what if it could bring out the best? And that is what sticks with me. It's not the action of swinging a baseball bat at a zombie, or the thrill of uncovering the conspiracy of a corrupt settlement. It's in the finality of the what if. What if that corrupt settlement could bring two estranged brothers one final chance to reconnect that they never would have gotten otherwise? What if the never-ending tragedy of death could bring about the definition of a man's identity? And what if the threat of the undead could bring a hardened, broken man to say something that he never could have otherwise? The simple fact that he loves his brother.
Te quiero, Javier.
Faith is a tree that wants only to grow. Cry in the dark for him who wanders alone. Hear the bells. Can you hear the bells? 7 wonders to take our breath away. What is